Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I want to explain a bit about the dual benefits, the dual levels of benefits that Indigenous nationals have. One, they have, because they've entered into treaties and provided permissions to Her Majesty to engage in partial political sovereignty in this part of the world, in their lands. There's a set and bundle of promises wrapped into that. And the benefits that come from treaty under the duty of fairness have to extend equitably. Okay, so these treaties, remember there was no one king to make one treaty. She went across and said to the people there, can you show me who can speak for you and make decisions for you, because I would like to get permissions from you. And I want them to be binding on you, and I want them to be lawful and secure. And so as she went, and as the Crown representatives went across, more and more treaties were provided. But because those treaties are with the same nation, okay, you look at any number treaty, for instance, you'll see a number of different Indian nations, Indian tribes referenced. It's important to understand that, you kind of look at each one's kind of, if there's a top-up that happened, it applies. She must apply those benefits across the board under the duty of fairness. Now there's a second set, and I'm not going to get into what does, in this talk, what does that mean, what do you get under treaty, that sort of thing. Remember, it's what you granted to, I want to get people thinking not, what are my treaty rights? I want people to be thinking, Indigenous nations to be thinking about what permissions did I grant, did my nation grant the Crown? Because that mind sense, remember, treaties didn't create the nations have entered into a number of treaties. So that's important to be changing the terminology. And also because, quote unquote, treaty rights is contained within Section 35, and that whole doctrine, that whole mess is in place. Again, it's important not to be using any language that could be seen to be triggering application of Section 35 doctrine. So what's the second set of benefits? Well, back in 1960, the feds in Canada decided, we're not getting too many Indians enfranchising and voluntarily leaving their nation to join Canada. But we want to treat them like a domestic ethnic minority. That's kind of tough if they're not even citizens of Canada, right? Because they're not. They're foreign nationals. They're a different nation, and that was the case. Even with the Indian Act in place, right? They could not be seen under Canadian law as citizens of Canada. And what happened to try to deal with that, because any of the new laws passed in order to grant, because Canadian citizenship itself is a new concept. People weren't Canadians way back, 200 years. So what they did is they simply passed a law to deem Indians, Indigenous nationals, to be also citizens of Canada. That way they can then try to work their magic of facilitating and manufacturing consent to being only a domestic ethnic minority, an Indigenous Canadian, and Aboriginals of Canada, right? So without realizing the implication, because of course, remember, the whole intent is you're all going to die off at some point. There's not going to be anyone around, and we don't really have to worry about the monetary aspects in the long term. We just got to either buy you off, trick you to sign off, or opt in, etc. And that's going to cost money in the short term because we know we got to pay people off. So what's the second set? You've got your benefits as an Indigenous national, has treaty relationship with the Crown, and been deemed Canadians. Well, what that means is, again, duty of fairness, equitable distributions of benefits and resources. Canada needs to provide the same level of services, the same kind of services as Canada does for all Canadians. Now, what that means is if there's, a certain amount of medical facilities located per grouping of Canadians, the same proportionate services needs to also be provided. So Canada cannot discriminate against Indigenous people vis-a-vis being a Canadian citizen, which Canada deemed them to be. Now keep in mind, many Indigenous nationals say, forget that. I never asked to be a Canadian citizen. I haven't consented to becoming a Canadian citizen. I don't agree with it. I don't want it. That's another issue. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is on Canada's side. Having done this, what does that mean in terms of their new obligations to provide for all Canadians, including this group of deemed citizens? So without realizing it perhaps or appreciating it, they doubled up. They doubled the obligations owing to Indigenous nationals. So, what brought this to mind was I was, heartbreaking reading on Facebook a cry from a Inuit young mother, right, whose baby is exhibiting signs that certainly I would be running into emergency to have my child checked out. Serious things suggesting meningitis, something like that, And here she was desperate because, there's a nurse in the community and the nurse says, don't worry about it, it's just stomach flu. Yeah, when I read all of the symptoms she's sharing, that's not any stomach flu that I've ever heard of. And she needs at the very least some support and comfort, because quite rightfully she fears her baby's at serious risk. And anyone reading what she had to share would agree with her. But what's the problem? Well, there's only 4 nurses in the general community, and 2 of them are away on holidays, and one's not opening and refuses to see her because she says, it's not important. There's a prime example. That community, that mother, is not receiving a level of medical care and emergency response that the government owes to all Canadians. And how many times have we looked at the shortfall for education for Indigenous children not meeting the standards per child that affect all Canadians? Canada needs to first catch up with, never mind these opt-in things and self-government stuff. The fact of the matter is they're just offloading responsibilities and not funding sufficiently, chiefs and councils or organizations that will be taking over these services and don't care, right? And what's being signed off on says, okay, you don't have to care. You don't have to, we're relieving you under the auspices of quote-unquote self-government. And really all it's doing is removing this bundle of benefits that Canada deemed Canada would give. So in terms of resolving critical matters, don't look to these initiatives. Look first to what exists and what's owed. And call on Canada. Call, as a Canadian, if you're going to speak like an ethnic minority, certainly, the very least, you can be insisting upon an equitable distribution of services. And if we're going into removing inadequate exercise of authorities and removing interference with actual authorities, then clearly finances are first and foremost. How can you deliver a service and meet needs without sufficient funding to do so? It's been proven without sufficient funds, Indigenous children, for example, are falling way behind. So that's all I have to say. Remember, two bundles of benefits. Why give those up, right? By acting under framework processes and agreeing with a chief that says we never were, we always were under Canada, you're giving up your treaty bundle. By not insisting that Canada meet an equitable distribution of resources, you're giving up your Canadian citizenship bundle. What do you have left at that point? Yeah, you can say you've been tricked and you didn't agree, but what about the people who are trying to live and survive? will this be the end? Because how do you do it? You've got communities already at high risk and high need. This isn't going to do it. This isn't going to help. This isn't going to heal. That's all I have to say.